I remember the day with a clarity that feels unnatural, as if life imprinted every detail into my memory out of respect for the pain it was about to deliver. The sky hung low, heavy with unshed tears. The air wasn't stormy, just subdued, like even nature understood that something was off balance. The phone rang just after 6 in the morning, and from the tone of the first word spoken, I already knew something was terribly wrong. My brother, Daniel, was gone. A car accident. I didn't cry, I couldn't. My limbs froze and my mind went silent, as if it refused to process the information. I stood barefoot on the cold tiles of the hallway, staring into the void of early morning, the phone still warm in my hand. My wife, Renee, approached quietly, sensing the tremor in the air before I could speak. She took the phone from me and set it aside, then led me to the couch like I was a sleepwalker, disconnected from the weight of reality. The hospital felt like a foreign country, sterile, fluorescent, thick with unspoken sorrow. I had to identify the body. They led me into a room where Daniel lay still, wrapped in a stillness so unnatural for a man who once filled every space with laughter and movement. I stood there for a long time, unsure if I was saying goodbye or begging the universe to rewind itself. But time doesn't barter, it only takes. Outside in the waiting room sat a boy so small he looked like he'd been abandoned by the world. Liam, my nephew, Daniel's son. He wore a denim jacket too large for him, shoes that didn't match, and a hollow expression that burned into my heart. He wasn't crying, wasn't asking questions. He just stared at the floor as if that was the only place left he trusted. No one had told him yet. That was the moment I knew my life was about to change. He brought Liam home the following week. There was no long discussion, no weighing of options. He was family, and that was enough. Renee and I converted the guest room, filled it with new furniture and bedsheets decorated with bright race cars. She bought clothes in every size just to be sure, along with cereal and snacks we thought he might like. He didn't talk much, not at first. But he followed me from room to room, watched everything I did, sat next to me while I paid bills or worked on a leaking pipe. Renee was gentle with him, motherly in ways I'd never seen before. She read to him at night, helped him organize his tiny closet, and learned how he liked his sandwiches, no crust, cut diagonally. We hadn't planned to have children yet, and in truth, I didn't know if we ever would. But with Liam, something awakened in both of us, a sense of purpose beyond our own lives. It was months before he called me Dad. I didn't expect it. He handed me a drawing of our house one morning, his name written in crooked letters at the bottom, and as he passed it to me, he muttered the word casually, like it had always belonged to me. I didn't say anything, just smiled and pulled him into my arms. I never corrected him, never reminded him I was his uncle. In that moment, we both needed to believe I was more. Years passed in quiet rhythms. Liam grew, not just in size but in spirit. He was curious, sharp, and thoughtful beyond his years. He loved to build things, Lego sets, puzzles, cardboard cities that stretched across our living room. I saw the beginnings of something remarkable in him. I signed him up for robotics clubs, architecture camps, and every science fair within driving distance. Renee embraced her role in his life as if she'd been born for it. She kept his schedule more diligently than I kept my own, attended every parent-teacher meeting, knew the names of all his friends. I would catch her watching him sometimes, not with the worry of a mother, but with something more elusive, something deeper I couldn't quite name. Admiration? Awe, I chalked it up to pride. That was easier than entertaining anything else. When Liam turned 17, he was already taller than me with his father's broad shoulders and quick wit. He worked part-time at my construction business during summer breaks, helping with inventory, planning minor site layouts. He wasn't passionate about it, but he worked hard. Because I asked him to. Because we were a team. That's what I believed. That's what I wanted to believe. Our home was modest, but filled with the echoes of shared time. Meals around the table, holiday photos on the walls, inside jokes and routines that gave structure to our lives. Renee and I had grown older together in the shadow of raising someone else's child, and in many ways that journey bonded us more tightly than anything else could have. Or so I thought. Graduation came in a blur. Liam stood tall in his gown, his name called with distinction. I filmed every moment with a camera that had recorded every milestone since the day he first rode a bicycle. When our eyes met across the stage, I felt something close to completeness. He had become a man, and I had been the one to guide him there. That knowledge filled me with a kind of satisfaction words could never fully capture. That summer, we celebrated his acceptance into a prestigious university. Friends and family filled our backyard with laughter and praise. I grilled steaks while Liam played his childhood music playlist and Renee beamed beside him, offering lemonade and stories from years past. In the quiet after everyone had gone home, I looked around at the life we had built and told myself, this is good. This is what a good life looks like. But sometimes good things start to erode not with explosions, but with silence. I came home early one afternoon, my flight canceled due to weather. The house was oddly quiet. No music, no clinking dishes in the kitchen. The television in the living room was on, playing some muted sitcom, but no one was there. I called out, assuming Renee might be in the garden or on a call. No response. As I climbed the stairs, I caught a scent that made me pause. A perfume Renee used to wear, bold, floral, expensive. She hadn't used it in years, claiming it gave her headaches. I followed it without thinking. It led me to Liam's room. Something stopped me from knocking, from entering. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was fear. I heard faint movement, a shuffle, a soft laugh, then silence. I backed away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks. That night over dinner, I studied their faces. Renee smiled but didn't meet my eyes. Liam asked about the business, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. I chewed slowly, tasting nothing. Something had shifted. I didn't know what, not yet. But a seed had been planted that day, a suspicion too terrible to fully consider and too persistent to ignore. And so, as I lay awake that night, listening to the rhythmic breath of the woman beside me, I began to review every moment I had ignored, every glance, every laugh, every brush of a hand across the back of a chair. My mind, once at peace, had become a battlefield. I didn't want war, but something inside me whispered, prepare. I tried to push the feeling away, the creeping sense that something had taken root in the walls of my home, growing slowly in the spaces between footsteps and half-finished sentences. For weeks, I convinced myself that it was stress. I told myself that marriages had their lulls and that boys who were once children grow into guarded young men. That was the logic I clung to. It was easier to believe in distance than betrayal. But I changed, quietly, imperceptibly. I became more alert, more observant. I began noticing the way Renee lingered when Liam spoke, how her eyes didn't just rest on him, but studied him, absorbed him. I noticed how he avoided physical contact with me, not out of disrespect, but as if proximity triggered something he couldn't face. They began taking walks together more often. At first, I thought it was sweet. Then I wondered why they never invited me. I started staying up later, working in the home office long after emails stopped coming. I wasn't working. I was watching, listening. I began to mark their rhythms, when they disappeared from common rooms, when they exchanged glances over coffee, when they retreated to their respective corners of the house and emerged hours later with the same rehearsed indifference. One evening, after Renee had gone to bed and Liam had retreated to his room, I sat in the darkened kitchen, unable to sleep. I was scrolling idly through my phone when I remembered that Renee's tablet had been acting up and she had asked me to fix it earlier that week. It was still charging on the counter. I opened it, at first intending only to reset a few settings, clear the memory, update the software. What I found instead was a message notification that lit up the screen. It wasn't explicit, just a preview, a single sentence, but it was enough to undo me. Wish I could kiss you again without looking over my shoulder. The sender's name was cryptic, just a single initial, L. I felt my insides twist. I read it 3 times, and then, despite every fiber in me screaming to stop, I opened the thread. There weren't many messages. They were careful. Most had been deleted. But the ones that remained were damning in their familiarity, the pet names, the references to shared moments that I had no knowledge of, the plans made for hours when I was away. I didn't cry, my body simply shut down. I placed the tablet face down, walked to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and stared at myself in the mirror. What kind of man doesn't see this coming? What kind of father raises a boy who becomes a shadow in his marriage? The face staring back at me was not one I recognized. It was older, colder, fractured. The next morning, I went through the motions. I poured coffee, read the newspaper, and responded to emails as if I hadn't discovered a fault line running beneath the foundation of my family. Renee kissed my cheek like she had 1,000 times before, and Liam asked if I wanted help with the garden that weekend. I nodded. I even smiled. It was the most elaborate performance I had ever given, and no one applauded. But I didn't want a confrontation, not yet. I wanted clarity, proof, context. I needed to understand how deep the betrayal ran, how long I had been living with a version of the truth edited just enough to keep me comfortable. I hired someone, a discreet professional, a man whose job it was to observe what others hid. He asked few questions and promised even fewer answers. Just facts. That's what I needed now. Not speculation, not jealousy, just the unfiltered truth. In the days that followed, I found myself drifting. My body was present, but my mind wandered through corridors of memory, re-examining every conversation, every shared glance, every moment of laughter between Renee and Liam. I questioned my parenting, my marriage, my instincts. Was I blind or simply unwilling to see? Had I poured so much into raising Liam that I failed to protect my own relationship? I became quieter, more withdrawn. Renee chalked it up to work. Liam looked at me longer now, as if he could feel something unspoken had shifted. He started spending more time out of the house, claiming group projects and library nights. She began going to yoga again, wearing perfume again, humming in the kitchen again. Everything looked normal. That's what terrified me most. A week later, the investigator returned with a manila envelope. Inside were photographs, dates, logs of locations, time stamps, nothing overly explicit, no motel keys, no physical proof of intimacy, but the weight of suggestion in each image was enough to crush me. There they were at a secluded park at dusk, in his car late at night, walking side by side down unfamiliar streets, her hand brushing his back, his eyes lingering too long. One picture showed them at a rooftop bar I'd never even heard of. She wore a red dress I didn't know she owned. I stared at those photos for hours, the clock ticking in the background like a countdown to detonation. I tried to rationalize, to build stories around them that made sense, that preserved my dignity. But lies built on lies eventually collapse. The dam was broken. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I began cataloging my own truths. I reviewed every financial transaction. I checked call histories. I examined home security logs. I looked at the house not as a sanctuary, but as a crime scene. Every room had become a chamber of suspicion. The guest room, the living room couch, even the back porch where we used to sip wine under the stars, it all felt contaminated. Renee began noticing my detachment. She asked if I was feeling okay, if I needed to talk. I smiled and said I was just tired. She reached for my hand across the table. I pulled away to pour more wine. Liam, too, began to shift. He started avoiding being alone with me. No more weekend projects, no late-night chats, just vague nods and polite conversations. His once warm energy had cooled to something formal, something cautious. I began to wonder who he was beneath the surface. The boy I had raised was gone. In his place stood a man I didn't recognize, confident, secretive, and dangerously comfortable in the shadows of my home. I thought back to Daniel, my brother, the man whose death had started all of this. I remembered our childhood, our sibling rivalries, the way he always said I was the responsible one. I had raised his son to be brilliant, capable, and fearless, but I had not taught him honor. That was my failure. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit in Liam's old room while he was away at college. The room still held traces of him, posters, books, trophies. It was a shrine to the innocence that once was. I'd sit there in the dark, the only light coming from the hallway, and ask myself where things went wrong. Was it the moment I let him call me Dad? Was it the moment I loved him more than myself? I began to plan, not revenge, not justice, just clarity. I wanted to give them the opportunity to confess, to look me in the eye and tell me who they really were. I needed them to say it, to own it, so I could finally decide who I would become after the dust settled. But they didn't. Days turned into weeks. Silence persisted. So I began writing. I started documenting everything, my thoughts, my suspicions, my pain. I compiled letters that I didn't send, drafted confessions that I didn't demand. I created a record of my descent, not into madness, but into awareness. I wanted history to remember that I knew, that I saw, that I chose to carry the knowledge rather than destroy everything blindly. And yet part of me still hoped that one of them would come to me in the quiet of night, eyes filled with remorse, begging for understanding. But the door never creaked, the footsteps never came, the silence remained whole. I began sleeping in the guest room. Renee asked why. I said the bed hurt my back. She didn't press. Liam didn't ask. On the surface, we remained a family. Underneath, we were strangers holding hands across a chasm, smiling for photographs we'd later delete. And in the stillness of those nights, I began to realize something. Sometimes the greatest betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from those you protected the most, the ones who knew the weight of your love and chose to use it as a stepping stone. I wasn't ready to confront them yet, but I was no longer pretending either. The night I decided to confront them was not born from rage, but from resignation. There is a specific fatigue that sets in when you live too long in the company of secrets, a kind of erosion. I had become like stone, weathered by winds I could not control, smoothed over by the passing of countless false smiles and empty gestures. I no longer sought the confrontation to punish. It began with a letter. I wrote it slowly over several nights, each sentence carved not with fury but with precision. I didn't name names or hurl accusations. I laid out moments, questions, observations, not as weapons but as mirrors. I left it on the kitchen counter one morning, neatly folded next to a cup of coffee that would grow cold before anyone dared to touch it. That evening the house was still. No accusations were hurled, no tears fell, but I knew they had read it. I could feel it in the air, the way Renee moved more quietly than usual, the way Liam didn't come down for dinner, the way my wine glass remained the only one on the table. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. Over the following days, a new kind of performance began. Renee tried to be more attentive. She brought me coffee in the morning, asked about my work, suggested we take a trip. Liam acted busy, long hours at school, studying late, avoiding eye contact. I watched them both with the calm detachment of someone observing the final act of a play he no longer believed in. But still, I said nothing. I wanted them to speak first. I needed to know if there was anything left in them worth salvaging. I needed them to step into the light by their own volition. Then came the final proof. Not a photograph, not a message, but a misplaced journal. I found it beneath the guest bed while searching for a spare phone charger. It was old, leather-bound, Liam's initials barely visible on the corner. I hadn't seen him write in a journal since he was a teenager. Curiosity mixed with dread as I opened it. The entries were sparse, dated sporadically, inconsistent in tone, but within the pages was the slow unraveling of a conscience. He wrote about confusion, about desire, about how blurred the lines had become. He wrote about Renee, about their connection, about how it felt both wrong and inevitable. He wrestled with guilt and then later rationalized it away. He never mentioned my name, not once, not as a father, not as an obstacle. I had simply been erased from the equation, a silent figure in the background of their unfolding intimacy. That, more than anything, was what broke me. I spent that night in my car, not because I had nowhere to go, but because I didn't trust myself inside that house anymore. I parked down the street, watched the lights go off one by one, and tried to convince myself that I still had a choice, that I could either burn it all down or walk away intact. But choices like that are illusions. There's no intact version of a man whose wife and adopted son share a bed behind his back. The next morning I packed a small bag, just the essentials. I left before sunrise, driving aimlessly for hours, through towns I didn't know, past fields and rivers and gas stations that felt like the edge of the world. I didn't check my phone. I didn't call anyone. I just needed distance, space enough to breathe without feeling like every breath was borrowed. When I returned 2 days later, the house felt different, like they had rehearsed something in my absence, a reset, a cover-up, but I no longer had the energy to engage. I went about my days like a ghost, present but not participating. They noticed, of course, but they never pressed. Cowards often choose silence when truth demands courage. I began therapy. I told no one. It was the only space where I could speak freely, where I could untangle the mess inside me without judgment. I didn't seek solutions. I sought understanding. And what I came to realize was this: betrayal doesn't begin in the act. It begins in the erosion of intimacy, in the small, repeated choices to turn away instead of toward. Renee hadn't cheated because she didn't love me. She cheated because she no longer saw me. And Liam hadn't betrayed me out of hatred, but out of weakness. Out of the deep human hunger to be seen, to be wanted, even at the cost of morality. But understanding did not bring forgiveness, nor did it erase the wound. It only clarified its shape. I considered divorce. I spoke with lawyers. I outlined what it would cost, who would keep what, how the story would be framed. But I couldn't bring myself to follow through. Not yet. Some part of me still clung to the idea that this house, this life, could be salvaged, that perhaps if they confessed, if they truly repented, there might be a way back. So I waited. One evening I returned home early again, not by design this time, but because I couldn't bear to be at the office. The house was quiet, too quiet. I climbed the stairs, that same perfume hitting me in the face like déjà vu. I moved slowly, each step heavier than the last. At the end of the hallway, Liam's door was ajar. I didn't knock, I didn't pause. What I saw confirmed everything. I didn't speak, I didn't make a sound. I simply turned around, walked down the stairs, out the front door, and kept walking. Not out of fear, not out of confusion, but because I finally knew the truth, and once you know, there is no room left for hope. That night I booked a hotel. I stayed there for a week. During that time, I began the process of detachment, not just legally, but emotionally. I closed shared accounts. I separated bills. I rewrote my will. I sold the house without telling them. I arranged to have my belongings moved into storage. And then on a Friday morning heavy with silence, I returned home with a single piece of paper, the divorce petition. I left it on the same kitchen counter where I had once placed my letter. I didn't wait for them to come home. I didn't need to see their faces. I had already seen everything. As I drove away for the final time, I felt no relief, no triumph, only a vast, echoing stillness, the kind that follows a storm that lasted too long. I had raised Liam as my own. I had loved Renee as my partner. I had poured every good part of myself into a family that was never truly mine, and in the end, I walked away with nothing but my name. But even that was enough, because it was still mine. And from that emptiness, I would begin again. After the dust settled and the legal signatures were dry, I found myself in a quiet apartment on the edge of the city. It was nothing like the house I left behind. There were no framed photographs on the walls, no scent of baked bread or perfume in the air, no echoes of laughter or late-night footsteps. Just clean walls, empty silence, and furniture that felt like it belonged to someone else. And yet, it felt more like home than the house I had built over 2 decades. The pain didn't vanish. It changed form. It stopped screaming and started humming, a low, constant murmur beneath everything I did. I woke up each morning and felt it resting on my chest like an old pet I couldn't put down. But I learned to live with it. I went to work. I cooked for one. I read books I never had time for. I let the silence keep me company. One evening, while unpacking boxes from storage, I came across a dusty bin marked Daniel. I hadn't opened it in years. It contained mementos from my brother's life, photos from our childhood, his college degree, old letters, newspaper clippings about his community work. Buried beneath it all was a small, weathered journal. I recognized it immediately. Daniel was never one for technology. He had always preferred to write things down, as if writing made them real. I hesitated before opening it. I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit a past that had already hurt so much. But something compelled me, a whisper that maybe there was something I had missed, something I still didn't understand. I sat down on the floor and flipped through the pages. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about work, reminders for groceries, thoughts about raising Liam alone. But near the back, the tone changed. The handwriting grew tighter, the sentences sharper. He began mentioning someone, his wife. Her name wasn't written, but the implications were clear. He suspected her of infidelity. He wrote about arguments, absences, strange behaviors. He suspected she had fallen for someone close to him. I read on, heart pounding. The last entries were unfinished fragments. One sentence stuck out like a blade. "If something happens to me, tell my brother to check the brakes." It didn't register at first. I read it twice, 3 times, check the brakes. I remembered the accident in vague flashes, a rainy night, a curve taken too fast, the report stating mechanical failure. At the time, I had accepted it as a tragedy, one of life's cruel, random blows. But now, with that sentence echoing in my head, everything shifted. I pulled out the accident report from the same box. It had sat untouched for years. I read every word this time, not just the summary, but the details. The report had noted anomalies in the brake line, but concluded no foul play. The car had been serviced just a week prior by a mechanic Daniel trusted. There had been no further investigation. My hands trembled. I wasn't just dealing with betrayal anymore. I was standing on the edge of a much darker revelation. Had my brother been killed? Had someone tampered with the car? I began to make calls, old colleagues of Daniel's, friends, neighbors. I tracked down the mechanic who had worked on the car. He was retired, living in Arizona, and remembered Daniel well. When I asked about the brake job, his tone changed. He said the brakes were in perfect condition when they left his shop. He had even driven the car himself. He had been shocked when he heard about the crash. That's when the questions started to snowball. Who had access to the car after it left the shop? Where had it been parked? Who had reason to want Daniel gone? I found myself thinking back to Liam's mother, Rachel. She had vanished not long after Daniel's death. No note, no explanation, just disappeared, leaving Liam behind. At the time, we assumed she had broken down emotionally and walked away from the weight of her grief. But what if that wasn't the truth? I requested archived police reports. There was nothing unusual in them, no investigation into foul play, no follow-ups. The case had been closed in under a week, but I found something else. Rachel had been questioned months before about a domestic dispute. The complaint was anonymous and no charges were filed, but neighbors had heard shouting, crashing furniture, a male voice yelling about betrayal. Why hadn't I known this? I started contacting people who had been close to Rachel. Most didn't know where she'd gone. Some thought she had moved to Oregon. Others claimed she had changed her name. But one person, a former coworker, told me she had once confided something strange, that Daniel had threatened to expose her affair, that he had said he would take full custody of Liam, that he had found letters, even pictures. The affair, the betrayal, the broken family. And then he died. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, a layer beneath everything I had been shown. I reached out to an old friend of Daniel, S., who had worked in law enforcement. I asked him to look at the case with fresh eyes off the record. He agreed reluctantly. A week later, he called me. He had found something. Apparently, someone had made an anonymous tip a week before Daniel's accident. The message was cryptic. He knows, she's scared, he won't make it to court. The tip had been filed and forgotten, never followed up. The officer at the time assumed it was a prank. But in light of everything I had uncovered, it felt damning. My mind turned in circles. Was Rachel behind it? Had she feared losing Liam? Had she lashed out? Or was there someone else involved? It was then, for the first time, a horrifying thought emerged. Could Liam have known? Not acted, not planned, but known. Had he suspected what his mother was capable of? Had he stayed silent? Had he lived with the guilt of unspoken knowledge? Was that why he attached himself to me so completely after the funeral? Not just out of love or fear, but because I was his only lifeline to safety. I didn't want to believe it, but the shadows had already gathered. I began going back through Liam's journals, not the recent one I had found, but old ones I had stored in boxes over the years. I had kept them out of sentimentality, never reading them, respecting his privacy, but privacy seemed like a luxury of the past now. I was no longer a guardian. I was a man searching for the full truth of a fractured past. Most entries were innocent, drawings, thoughts, school crushes, but in one dated just weeks after Daniel's death, I found a line that shattered me. I know what I saw, but no one will believe me. Maybe it's better to pretend. He had written it in shaky cursive, tucked between pages about baseball and math homework, as if he had tried to bury it even from himself. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I read it until the ink felt etched into my skin. He had seen something, known something. Maybe even understood that his father's death was not an accident. And still he had allowed me to raise him, to love him, to build my life around him. Had he been protecting me, or protecting himself? I didn't confront him, there was no point. By now our lives were severed. I hadn't spoken to him or Renee since the divorce was finalized. I didn't know where they lived, I didn't care, or so I told myself. But one night, unable to sleep, I wrote Liam a letter. I didn't accuse, I didn't demand. I just told him what I had discovered, about Daniel, about Rachel, about what I had found in the journals. I told him I didn't hate him, that I didn't even blame him. I told him that silence can be heavier than guilt, and that maybe after everything it was time to stop pretending. I never mailed the letter. Instead, I placed it in the same box with Daniel's journal, the police report, the accident file. A box that now sat at the back of my closet like a tombstone no one could see. I told myself the truth was enough. That knowing was closure, that justice doesn't always wear a uniform. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Because the past doesn't rest just because you turn the page. It waits until you're ready to face it again. Some endings come with a bang, others with a signature, and a few with a silence so complete, it echoes louder than any scream. Mine came with all three. After uncovering the truth, or at least enough of it to know there was no going back, I stopped searching. Not because I had all the answers, but because I had learned that truth, like grief, isn't always clean or finite. It stretches, it distorts, it grows teeth, and if you chase it too far, it might swallow you whole. Instead, I focused on reclaiming something that had once belonged to me, myself. It started slowly, cautiously. I resumed my morning walks, no longer haunted by the echo of footsteps I used to expect behind me. I repainted the walls of the apartment, replaced the furniture with pieces I actually liked, not what matched the aesthetic of a life I no longer lived. I deleted numbers from my phone. I closed social media accounts. I let the old version of me die quietly without ceremony. But grief is a clever thing. It doesn't vanish when you decide it's time. It waits until your guard is down, at a red light in a grocery aisle between paragraphs of a book you're reading, and then it whispers, "Remember." And I always did. I remembered Liam's first day of school and how tightly he gripped my hand. I remembered the Christmas we spent building a snow fort in the backyard until our fingers turned numb. I remembered the night he got accepted into university and how he cried, not because of joy, but because he finally believed he was enough. And I remembered Renee. The way she used to hum in the mornings, how she couldn't fall asleep without the sound of rain, the way she looked at me the night I proposed, as if I had given her the moon. I remembered the softness before the storm. That's what hurt most. But memories are double-edged. They keep people alive, but they also keep wounds fresh. I avoided places we used to visit. I changed routes. I didn't go near the church where we married. I avoided the bookstore where we had picked out Liam's first picture book. I even stopped shopping at the supermarket across town where we once debated over which pasta sauce tasted more authentic. I constructed a new life with invisible borders. It wasn't healing, it was management. But it worked. Then one morning in early autumn, I received a letter. A real letter, handwritten, no return address. The moment I saw Liam's handwriting, I felt a mixture of dread and longing so sharp it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. I waited 3 days to open it. When I did, I read it standing up, as if sitting might make the words too permanent. It was short, measured, written like a man who had spent a long time rehearsing every syllable. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer explanations. Instead, he wrote about a decision, one that he said had haunted him for years. He told me he had known, not everything, but enough. That Rachel had confessed something to him days before Daniel's death, that she had been scared, that she thought Daniel might take Liam away from her, that she was desperate. He said she hadn't admitted to tampering with the car, but that she had made comments, threats spoken in half-truths, veiled behind tears and regret. Liam had been 12. He hadn't understood the full weight of what he'd heard, but he'd known something was wrong. He said that after the crash, when Rachel vanished, he had felt both abandoned and relieved, as if some terrible pressure had been lifted. And when I took him in, when I gave him a home, he had made a decision to never speak of it again. He hadn't expected to love me the way he did. He hadn't expected that guilt would grow as his affection did. And by the time he was old enough to make sense of it all, he was too far in. The lie had calcified. He ended the letter with something that pierced deeper than any confession. "You raised me better than I turned out to be." I didn't cry, not immediately, but I held the letter to my chest like it was the last fragment of a burned photograph, and I stood there for hours. When I finally folded it and placed it in my drawer, I knew I would never read it again. Some truths, once received, do not need to be revisited. Weeks passed, the seasons turned. I began to notice that the silence in my apartment no longer felt hostile. It became companionable, almost comforting. I could hear my own thoughts again. That was when I made the decision to leave the city. There was nothing left for me here but ghosts. Every streetlight, every bench, every alley carried a shadow I didn't want to see. So I packed up my life into a moving truck and headed north, to a small lakeside town where no one knew my name and no one cared who I had once been. The house I bought was modest, 2 bedrooms, a wide porch, a small garden out back. It was enough, more than enough. It felt honest. No illusions, no facades, just walls and windows and quiet. I spent my mornings drinking coffee by the lake. I read more. I wrote in notebooks I never intended to publish. I volunteered at the local library. I found fragments of peace in things that asked nothing of me. And yet, every now and then, I would think of Daniel. I would see his face in my mind, laughing at a joke I can no longer remember or nodding in approval over something I'd built. I thought about what he would have said if he had known, if he had seen what became of his son, of me, of the woman I once called my wife. I imagined us sitting side by side, 2 old men watching ducks on a lake, speaking in the silence that only brothers understand. I hoped he would forgive me, for not seeing, for not asking, for not protecting Liam from the past or myself from the future. But more than that, I hoped he had found peace, because I was still searching for mine. One day, nearly a year after I moved, I walked into a local diner for breakfast. It was the kind of place where regulars left their own mugs on hooks, and the waitress knew everyone's order by heart. I sat by the window and sipped my coffee slowly, listening to the buzz of small-town life around me. And then across the room I saw a boy, no, a man who looked just like Liam, same jawline, same posture. He was laughing with someone, probably a friend. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. My body reacted before my mind caught up. I blinked, looked again. It wasn't him, just a stranger, but the resemblance was enough to open the floodgates. I left the diner quietly and walked along the lake, letting the wind dry the tears I hadn't felt coming. It struck me then that I would always carry him with me, not as a wound, but as a story. A story with chapters I never asked to write but had lived nonetheless. I sat on a bench and looked out across the water, the light shimmering on its surface like 1,000 tiny truths. And I whispered something, not to him, not even to myself, but to the space between what was and what might have been. Goodbye. Not bitter, not broken. Just final. That was the moment I stopped being the man who had lost everything, and started becoming the man who had survived. I used to believe closure came with answers. That if you peeled back every layer of betrayal, exposed every hidden truth, confronted every wound, you'd eventually reach some solid ground, some emotional bedrock that allowed you to rebuild. But I've come to realize that closure isn't about answers. It's about acceptance. It's about walking away even when the page feels unfinished. It's about surrendering the need to make sense of pain, because some pain was never meant to be solved. It was only meant to be survived. Years have passed since I left the city behind. Life in the lakeside town unfolded in slow rhythms: sunrise coffee, afternoons in the garden, evenings with a book or a walk under dying amber skies. Time didn't move here the way it did in the city. It didn't chase me or demand apologies. It simply offered space, and for a long while that was enough. But the mind is never fully still. Sometimes in dreams I would return to that old house, not the one with the betrayal, but the version before, when Liam was 10 and we were building birdhouses in the garage, when Renee was humming softly in the kitchen and the world still felt whole. The dreams would never last. I'd wake up to the sound of my own breathing and the steady tick of a clock that only ever moved forward. One late autumn, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to. On the other end was a woman, her voice soft, careful, almost rehearsed. She introduced herself as a social worker from a private hospital. She told me Liam had checked himself in. Not for substance abuse, not for legal reasons. For guilt. He had suffered a breakdown, not sudden, slow, accumulated over years. Layers of silence, betrayal, and unspoken shame had finally collapsed in on him like a failing structure, quiet at first, then thunderous. He had confessed everything, not just to her but to himself, about the affair, about the things he suspected his mother had done, about the boy he had been, and the man he became. I said nothing. I didn't ask for details. I didn't offer comfort. I just listened, as one might listen to the final chapters of a book they thought they had already finished. The woman said Liam had requested one thing, that I be told, not because he expected anything, but because it was time. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table for hours, staring out into the wind-brushed garden. I felt no rage, no vindication, only the echo of a life lived too close to fire. Days later, I received a second envelope, this time postmarked and signed in his own hand. Inside was a letter, folded with the kind of precision that suggested fear more than formality. He wrote as if he were speaking to a grave. He spoke of guilt not as an emotion, but as a companion, one that had followed him through every success, every relationship, every achievement. He said that loving me had been the most honest thing he ever did, that betraying me had been the worst. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't say he deserved peace. But he hoped I had found mine. I didn't respond, not with words, not with letters. Instead, I took the letter to the edge of the lake behind my house. I stood beneath a sky rippling with low-hanging clouds, the water still as glass. I read the letter one more time, then folded it again, and placed it into the fire pit where I often burned dried leaves in the fall. I watched the flame curl its edges, blacken the ink, erase the sentences one by one until all that remained was ash. I scooped it into my palm and scattered it into the wind. Some things don't need to be kept. They need to be released. That night I slept without dreams. In the months that followed, I began writing again, not journals or letters, stories, fiction. I wrote about fathers and sons, about quiet betrayals and the weight of silence. I wrote not to remember, but to reshape what had once been unbearable into something I could place on a shelf, something that no longer bled when touched. People in town began to know me not as the quiet man who lived alone, but as the one who wrote with depth and grief and strangely luminous hope. I never explained the source of those stories. Some truths lose power when told directly. They speak better through metaphor. I volunteered at a local youth center once a week, mentoring boys from fractured homes. I didn't offer them lectures or formulas. I offered them presence. I became the man I once needed, the man I thought I had been. And slowly, without realizing, I forgave. Not in one sweeping moment, but in countless tiny acts of letting go. I forgave Renee, not because she deserved it, but because I deserved the freedom of no longer holding her in the prison of my mind. I forgave Liam, not because he was innocent, but because he had paid in ways only he would ever fully understand. I even forgave myself for trusting too easily, for loving too hard, for believing that being a good man would insulate me from heartbreak. One morning, while hiking a trail near the edge of town, I came upon a family of deer, a buck, a doe, and a fawn. They stood still as stone, watching me without fear. I stood still too, allowing the moment to stretch. In their eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, quiet. And in that quiet, I whispered something I had never said out loud. Not to Renee, not to Liam, not even to myself. I made it out alive. That was enough. I no longer needed to write their names to remember them. They lived in the spaces between my thoughts, in the way I now noticed the colors of autumn leaves, in the way I placed 2 spoons on the table just in case someone unexpected visited, in the way I paused at crosswalks not out of hesitation but awareness. I knew Liam was still in the hospital. I knew Renee had moved to another state and remarried. I didn't follow their lives. I didn't seek them out. But sometimes when I stood at the edge of the lake, I imagined they were well, not because they earned it, but because wishing someone well is not the same as welcoming them back. It is the final act of letting go. I didn't have a grand ending. No dramatic reunion, no courtroom closure, no final scene with music swelling in the background. Instead, I had something smaller, something harder won, peace. Peace that came not from erasing the past, but from learning to live alongside it without fear. Peace that came from refusing to let betrayal define me. Peace that came from knowing I had loved and lost, and still found myself worthy. And so I sit here now by the lake, notebook in hand, pen poised above a blank page. The sun dips low, scattering gold across the water. The wind carries no scent of old perfume, only pine and smoke. And I begin to write again. Not about them, but about me. About the man who raised a boy and lost him. About the man who was betrayed and survived. About the man who once believed his life was over and discovered it had only just begun.